Welcome to POC Stories. Today I'm recording Tara, a climate activist based in Philippines, and we're going to talk about climate change and especially focusing on the marine ecosystem in Philippines. So can you introduce yourself?
I'm Tara Santos. I'm a 22-year-old climate activist from the Philippines. Um, I am the national coordinator of Extinction Rebellion Philippines. And if you don't know what Extinction Rebellion is, it's a global movement that calls governments and corporations to act on the climate crisis. Um, I just graduated from the New School in New York City, and I'm planning to move back home to focus on my activism. Yeah. And I guess my personal activism, besides being the national coordinator for Extinction Rebellion Philippines, my own personal research is about plastic pollution and looking at how to eradicate plastic pollution through looking at systems of capitalism, consumerism, classism, and colonialism. So kind of looking at the structures that allow for plastic pollution to have the bad effects that it has today and the social implications of those. Yeah.
Mhm. And why did you decide to become a climate activist?
Um, well, I think I've always really cared about the environment. I think growing up in the Philippines and also my mom made it a very important topic to discuss growing up. I never really considered myself an activist because I feel like my work in terms of the environment was very private. I was never public about it, so I never considered myself one. It was only this year in March when I joined my first ever Extinction Rebellion action, and that was in New York with Extinction Rebellion Universities US. And so after I joined that first action, I think just like the feeling, the adrenaline I got, and also just being surrounded with like-minded people who I feel like it took me a while to get to that point of realizing the kinds of people who I wanted to surround myself with. And when I realized that Extinction Rebellion was one of those like groups or had people who I connected to, that's when I was like, I think I want to bring it back home to the Philippines. One of my friends, Valentin, a band, he was kind of the one who like pushed me to start it. He was the one who was like really supportive. He forced me to go to these like trainings and stuff like that. And I don't think without him I would have done it. Yeah.
Or And yes, I saw you did like a campaign awareness, aquatic awareness, or what's it? And I just wanted to know, so can you explain what it is about this campaign?
Yeah, so the Aquatic Awareness campaign, it was a collaboration between Extinction Rebellion Philippines and Our Endangered. Our Endangered is run actually by my best friend. And so she talks about specifically species that are endangered in the Philippines. And so for that collaboration, we wanted to touch on like Filipino people and their stories and how they relate to our marine life and ecosystems. Because growing up here, um, yes, like we're surrounded by oceans, but a lot of the time, like I grew up in the city, I wasn't like surrounded by like the oceans like most of the time. So it's kind of hard to see the effects if you're not like at the beach or diving or something like that. So we just want to raise awareness and kind of show how we are connected to like our marine ecosystems and how it actually plays a really important part in our lives and um, even like our economy, like in the Philippines, how much it relies on like fishing and agriculture, tourism, things like that. Yeah.
Mm. And although you didn't grow up around the beaches, did you notice still like the effects on the marine ecosystem?
Yeah. So I got my scuba diving license like 10 years ago. Before that, a lot of our family vacations, we go snorkeling and things like that. And I remember one of the first things that I noticed, it wasn't like one exact moment where I realized that it was happening, but the more I started to dive, I think the first thing I realized was the coral bleaching, and that basically happens when the temperatures of the seawater are too hot, and so the corals essentially die off because of the amount of carbon and heat in the water. Um, yeah, so I think that was it. It was really just the coral bleaching, and now that obviously the temperatures are rising, now that they're really getting high, it's starting to become a lot more prevalent, even in deeper or like deeper waters. Because before it used to be just shallow waters, where obviously it was a lot easier for the sun to penetrate and hit the corals. But now I'm starting to see it like even deeper when I go diving. So yeah. Um, and oh, and also a big part of it was noticing the amount of waste that was in the water. And it was weird because when I started to do my cleanup dives, I realized that it was actually a lot harder to find plastic in the ocean than I thought it would be. I thought that because I mean it already is so polluted, it would be easy to find. But I think because of how long the plastic has been in the water for, it was so hard to distinguish what was marine life or what was plastic. And that scared me because if a human can't distinguish that and they know what plastic is, I can't imagine what a turtle or any kind of marine life would, how they would distinguish that, and they can't. And that's why it's really dangerous.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And could you like explain like the causes of the degradation of marine ecosystem in Philippines?
Yeah, so a lot of it mainly is the effects of the climate crisis, and that ranges from increasing greenhouse gases, so that's usually carbon in the atmosphere, and unsustainable fishing practices. And so the thing is with the Philippines is that there are protected areas, but there is no political will to keep these legislations or to make sure that people are following it. And there was actually like one incident where I was diving in this one island called Puerto Galera, and it was a marine sanctuary. But when I was diving there, there were actually people like spearfishing, and we were the ones who physically had to tell them to stop and explain that it was a protected area. But of course, a lot of people in the Philippines live under poverty, and so they don't care. They just want to be able to fish and sell. Yeah.
Mm. But do you think like people in Philippines start to gain more awareness regarding climate change, for example, and the importance of the marine ecosystem?
I think that because of the amount of typhoons we experienced this year, people are really aware that it's because of the climate crisis. Growing up, the narrative around typhoons and climate change in the Philippines was very, it was almost like we romanticized how resilient we were because we kept getting hit by typhoons like one after the other, and people kept saying, oh, like no matter what happens, like the Philippines will always like push through. But the narrative now is kind of shifting to we shouldn't even be dealing with this in the first place. And in terms of responsibility for why these typhoons or climate catastrophes are happening, if you're looking at emissions, let's say, usually the people or the nations that are affected the most emit the least amount of greenhouse gases. So big polluters, let's say, are the US and China. But of course, they aren't being hit by typhoons the same way people in the global south are. Yeah. I don't think that people really associate, let's say, like coral reefs and or like marine life to their views on climate change. I think that I'm just more aware of that because I scuba dive and I'm I'm like actively trying to learn more about it. Um, but I think that's kind of like one of my missions as an activist because I really want to kind of bridge the gap between why like conserving nature is actually really important to us as a species, and not just for like survival but also for well-being.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And yes, so also plastic is damaging the coral reefs. And could you like explain why is it the importance of preserving coral reefs?
Yeah. So in the Philippines, I think it's 42% of the population rely on coral reefs for food or for sustenance. And also coral reefs play a very big role in um, protecting coastlines from typhoons. And so they kind of act as like a buffer or protection layer. But obviously when they're damaged, they can't do that. Another thing is um, they're really important in regulating the amount of carbon in the water and the carbon in the atmosphere. So, but what's happening essentially is that's the reason why um, corals are getting bleached is because there's too much carbon in the water, and that's why they can't really do their job of regulating the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or in the sea. And obviously that has not just effects on the corals themselves, but every single organism on this planet.
Mm.
um, yeah, I think that especially in the Philippines where we get hit by typhoons a lot, I think that's why the conversation about kind of protecting our marine ecosystems or even just a natural system, like or even not just coral reefs, but even forests, how they prevent landslides. I think that's one of the main like conversations that we need to have too, or things that we need to bring to light. Yeah.
And regarding the government, do you think the government is doing something to try to? Do you think the government is now more aware of the importance of the climate crisis, or?
Um, I I think so. So I think that because of the again, like what I said earlier, the amount of typhoons that we experienced, kind of it was a reality check that it's really difficult for us to recover, especially when we're getting hit by typhoons like one after the other. Especially now that it's happening at the same time as a pandemic that we're also really struggling with. Um, it became even more of a like, yeah, a reality check. And so it was one of the first times where the narrative of or like resiliency, Filipino resiliency, was changed to like preventing these things from happening in the first place. And I was almost shocked. But at the same time, let's say like the National Climate Change Commission, they we just had like a meeting with them, or like a lot of like government groups and civilians had a meeting with them to discuss their nationally determined contributors for the Paris Climate Agreement. And those are basically the things that a country is going to contribute to lowering or keeping global warming or the warming of the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And when they were proposing our ideas, I still don't think that it's ambitious enough. Um, and I think that's also because of how entangled the public and private sectors have become here. Like the amount of corruption and things like that, I think prevents actual legislation from being passed. It prevents actual action from being done because people are too scared to take the risk, of course. And when big corporations are involved, and becomes a lot more complicated. But I think that's the goal of Extinction Rebellion and a lot of like climate groups in the Philippines, is to make sure that they're held accountable and to realize that taking care of our planet is and taking care of our ecosystem, our environment in the Philippines is taking care of our people too. Yeah.
Mhm. And so, how many typhoons did you have in Philippines this year?
I think we had a total of 23 this year. And a lot of the yeah, and a lot of the work, and what's really dangerous about the Philippines is that a lot of the work that activists do, trying to bring light, like to shed light on what the government's involvement and how climate action is not being done. There's this thing called the junk terror law. I mean, sorry, not the junk terror law, the terror law. And basically, people are getting red tagged or being persecuted for being activists or doing work or speaking out against the government, which obviously is very dangerous. Yeah.
And so, usually, what is the normal amount of typhoons in Philippines?
I think we experience around 20, like on average a year. Yeah. And let's say, like, the scary part is that when they're happening at the same time as the pandemic, there's no social distancing in evacuation centers. There's also not enough money for like PPE or even food. And that's why a lot of the work that was done for recovering and helping these like affected communities were done by the private sector. They were done by groups. They were done by like environmental groups, or even there were a lot of individual initiatives too. Yeah.
And can you explain what is your fundraising about?
Yeah. Oh, so my fundraiser is called Compulsive Coloring. I started it because when Typhoon Ulysses hit the Philippines, I was still in New York, and I felt that I wanted to do more than just like ask people to donate. And so at that time, I was kind of making these drawings for my friends and things like that. And I was just like, I think that this would be a really good idea for a fundraiser because the drawings helped me. The reason why I called it compulsive coloring is because I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And so those drawings kind of help me, like they're almost like meditative in a way. So it feels good that like this work helps me and it also helps Filipinos who are being affected by the climate crisis. Yeah.
And do you have anything to say?
Um, I think that maybe coming into 2020, maybe we should become more aware of our environment and how we interact or even talk about it, kind of reviews on sustainability. Um, I like to say that like I think everything kind of starts with like learning or like learning to educate yourself. And I'm biased. I'm gonna say go to groups like Extinction Rebellion or because they have groups everywhere. Yeah, yeah,
Then thank you, Tara. And yeah, that was this is very important, and because I feel like there is not so much awareness, especially in Europe, because I'm based in Europe, and I feel like when you talk about climate change, it's just climate change in Europe. Like, how does it affect Europe? But the rest, like, it's happening right now in other countries. Like
yeah,
my father is from Senegal, and we noticed climate change when I was 6 years old, and now I'm 28. So it was such a long time ago, but it was not such a thing because it
yeah,
was affecting like European countries. But right now,
yeah.
the things.
Um, yeah, that's why I was kind of upset, or I'm still very confused about the whole like conversation about climate, especially when it affects, let's say, like the US or Europe versus when it affects a country like the Philippines.
Yeah.
Because I remember when the California fires happened, and I think that was September or yeah, or August this
Yeah.
year.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone in the Philippines was like talking about these fires that were happening in the US, but there was no spark when we were actually being hit by typhoons. There was like no conversation about climate change when we were the ones actually being affected by it. And then that's why like a lot of my work deals with looking at like colonialism, classism, and things like that. Because I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to connect. And that's why I like to like go back to like our indigenous practices. Because I think that they hold like all the answers. Because I think that essentially the relationship with nature is reciprocal. You can't take any more than they can provide. So yeah, I think that's the work that has to be done, kind of decolonizing even the climate movement, or even like the unwhitening of the climate movement, because I feel like the white savior narrative is still very prevalent. And climate, or the glorification of white individuals or white activists just because they're white. Yeah,
Yeah. I definitely agree.
it's like yeah, it makes me really mad because I remember watching like I used to like remember like I used to love David Attenborough's films, and then like I watched it again and I was like, oh my gosh, this is such like a white savior narrative.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's not to like diminish the work that they do, because they are doing good work, but I think that we have to be a little bit more critical in how we kind of glorify these people or their reasons for wanting to do this work, especially when they aren't being directly affected by the climate crisis themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.